Okay, we're going to try this again. We had a technical problem. Let me know if you guys can hear me, if anyone sees this on their timeline. This is DIY Disclosure Podcast, and it is episode 4, Gavin Wince. Hopefully this time with audio. Let's invite Gavin. Fingers crossed. He's trying it on his computer this time. All right. It's coming your way, buddy. There's a new link. All right, let me tell you a bit about Gavin while we're trying to get this show on the road. Gavin Wince, it's been a unique pleasure getting to know him in X Spaces and such. He does a lot of things. He's a philosopher of science. He's the founder of Existics. He's a documentarian. He's an entrepreneur with some very, very big projects, and he's a kindred spirit and an inspiration to me. And I think we have a lot in common, and it'd be fun to kind of figure out areas that we might have some nuances in our. We're both. I think we'll see what he says. A very, very beautiful woman recently told me that she thought I was a structural revolutionist. And I wonder if Gavin Wince would say he's the same, among other things, in terms of his philosophy and his desire, his unique ability, his drive to bring these ethereal itches and philosophies and turn them into tangible reality. Gosh darn it! I think for me anyway, to help all planetary life, etc. And I think he wants to do that too. Let's see. He's going to hopefully populate this this new episode at any moment. Hopefully his computer's working. If not, well, you can always just hear me ramble on, unless of course my mic's not working either. It looks like it is. Chrissy, are you there? Let's get a mic check. And today, it's been quite a day of streaming and broadcasting. I had a Twitter X space that I just had to hit the kill switch on, sadly, to come here. But we made news with the world's first whistleblower to come out for UAP disclosure independently, which is a big deal, if you understand the nuances of what's going on here. He came out through X Spaces, and we've been talking with him over the last month or so, and we had a very long and revelatory space. He's a very brilliant and gracious man who's worked for the government in many secret, high-level ways, and has decided at this point in his life and career to be a whistleblower and witness and to share his truth. But he's a real credentialed employee of the government in these secret programs. So as is Anjali, who was going to be our last guest, but I think she's under the weather. So we'll be rescheduling that episode very soon. I don't see Gavin popping up. I did restart everything. It does seem to be working. Is anyone? We got 9 people. If we got any eyes and ears, please confirm. Let's do a mic check. Anyone hear me? Mic check. It looks like the signal is coming in nice and green over here. All right. More on okay, so that was Jason Sands. Okay, so check that out. I put that in the comments so you can see that. Not at the same time as watching this though. Let's one and then the other. Let's find it. I just gotta open up my Twitters. Well, it's funny. Spaces is now the most reliable way to communicate. It used to be it's usually the most glitchy for me, but then again, things can always go wrong, can't they? Oh, look, it's Tom Thompson. He's going to be on the podcast too. Okay. Look at that. All right. There's some yucky people in the next part of the timeline. Right. Oh, yes, my account and my. Oh, let's see. Is Gavin in here yet? No Gavin. Okay. It's working less effectively than last time. Did he not get the invite? Let's check my messages. Any luck with the new link? Okay, we'll get that working hopefully. Oh, I see him. Okay. Okay, hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. How's that? That works.
Well, I like your studio. I hear you have like a speaker something. But I can take those out if I need to.
How's that? Does that sound?
Let me speak. Oh, I'm still echoing.
Am I echoing on? I don't hear an echo on my end.
You sound good to me.
Okay.
I can maybe just take my headphones out. And if people have an issue with the sound, just let me know. You hear me good. Okay, we're good. Oh wait, I won't be able to hear you though. That's the one downside. Okay, we're still figuring out the details how to do this. So you don't have any speakers playing like out loud? Maybe that would be causing an echo. Maybe. All right, let me see if I can close some extra windows. 1 second.
Maybe I should put an earpiece in. Maybe that would help, because I do have, like, obviously I have the speakers in the computer. So let me try.
In chat, if you have audio troubles, let us know. We might have to reset again, and if so, it's no big deal. It'll just shatter my soul, but we'll recover eventually.
Give me a second. There.
Cool.
Does that work?
Sounds good.
Better?
You fixed it. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, hopefully other people can. At least we can vibe, and that's a great start. I love everything that's going on here so far. You look like the hero of like a David Cronenberg film.
Okay.
And I like how my background currently is so light, and yours is like super. It's like a yin yang aesthetic. So okay, so now that we're rolling, hopefully proper audio. So again, okay, this is the start of DIY Disclosure Podcast, episode 4, with my friend Gavin Wince. He's correct me if I'm wrong, a philosopher of science, the founder of Existics, documentarian, an entrepreneur. He's creating a new internet. There's a lot to discuss. He's got a YouTube channel, which I put in the description. There's an article on, if you're okay with this, heavy.com that kind of explains who he is and sort of the interesting, his interesting relationship. And he's a person of the world, and I think you might enjoy that. I put the Existics 101 website. I definitely recommend you check it out. I was actually reading it to the people before you joined, and I'm really into it so far. So are there any basic things we need to introduce the world to who Gavin Wince is, other than the things I listed off so far?
It sounds like you've covered enough that you can just start by questions, and we go from there.
All right, very cool. Very cool, Gavin. So yes, it's been fun. A really, really wonderful time talking with you in my spaces with Roy Herbert and other scientific philosophical geniuses like you, man. Hold on 1 second. I just So we have a lot of things in common. I feel like you're a kindred spirit, and you're so far along in the things you've done that you're an inspiration to me in so many ways. Let's start with the philosophy, because to me that's kind of the source code for how a human lives. Could you begin to introduce your philosophy to the people listening?
So basically, I've created something that I call Existics. And it essentially is the study of the laws that govern existence. And so at an early age, I just had an eye for pattern recognition, but particularly patterns in things that are not connected, if you know what I mean. Like I would commonly see a relationship between things that others would think I was crazy, like they didn't see that, right? So Existics became sort of a desire to figure out a way to express this interconnectivity that I was picking up on at a young age. So at a certain point, a couple of things happened, really. One, there was this time when I was late teens and I was in a car with some friends, and I had not really a vision, but to make a long story short, everything seemed to be connected in such a way that it seemed like the car driving down the road, the guy mowing his lawn, the bird flying through the air, the moon in the sky, that they were all like pieces of one big clock. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like everything actually being intimately connected in sort of a backdrop sense. And so I sort of saw like the sky and the horizon, everything is like a male and a female in an embrace. And their embrace was the manifestation of everything we were seeing. But what I would more technically describe it as is sort of a physicalness and a non-physicalness interweaving within one another in a fractal manner, and everything being just a variation of that fractal relationship. So yeah.
Sorry, I'm taking notes as always. Whenever you talk, I always end up taking notes. I love how you said the sky and horizon in an intimate embrace, which will, of course, be an art project soon. Yeah, I love that idea of the connectiveness of all things. And it was interesting how you described the whole world working together like a backdrop clock.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say a backdrop to what, I guess?
Like a backdrop to reality, like a more subliminal truth, something that's not in the foreground but more in the background. You know what I'm saying? Like a more backdrop unifying principle to things, right? Um, like for instance, having experiences, I'm sure people did when they're young and hanging out with friends and stuff, having odd experiences when you're out hiking or in nature, where or just coincidental experiences, things that give you a clue that there are connections that aren't apparent, right? Like, is it in another dimension or whatever? You know what I mean? So I had these kind of inclinations when I was young. Like when I was really young, I'd study the paranormal. Um, as a little kid, it's kind of interesting. My mother's OBGYN was a famous doctor named Dr. Bradley who actually studied the paranormal, and he had a haunted house. So when I was a kid and my mom was doing Lamaze type exercises for my sister, um, when she was pregnant with my sister, I had some interesting paranormal experiences at his home, and he had purchased this mansion in the Denver, Colorado area specifically to study these things. And when I was 5 years old, I got to meet very briefly. Um, oh, come on, the spoon bending guy, Uri Geller.
Oh,
So, so, and then like with my master's degree program that I went through, that was out of a program that was ran out of the Philosophical Research Society that was founded by Manly P. Hall. And a lot of people involved in that program were also part of SRI and some of the Stargate program. So my life has always had these, you know, overlaps with, if you want to call it paranormal. For me, I look at it more analytically because it's not something strange or mystical for me. Does that make sense? So, so a lot of what Existics was or is that as I went into college and became very academically inclined, spending a lot of time going into mathematics, I started seeing one kind of like a need, and two, a way to capture what I was seeing, but with a more rigorous formalization so that then it could be expressed, toyed with, maybe applied to physics and other branches of science, etc. So that's sort of where it all comes from. If that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And so you combine these early experiences and unusual ability to recognize patterns, and then you study mathematics, and then yeah. So what more should we know about existics and this whole philosophy?
Um, well, really, it's kind of there's a million places I could go. One thing I can say is a significant part of what I call existics is what I call the existics equations, and it's a series of equations that I derived simply by resolving a sort of a paradox I found having a conversation with my grandmother. And what it was is I asked her because it's one of those things when you're who hasn't asked themselves, does time go by faster as I'm getting older? Because I think it's kind of a natural thing we all experience. So I asked my grandma when I was in my teenage years, hey grandma, does time go by faster for you now that you're in your 90s? And she said to me that it goes by so fast that she could see the grass grow, right? So metaphorically, yes, right? But what that did was it made me realize there's sort of a situation here where if two people are experiencing time at different rates, then how is there able to be simultaneity in their experience, right? Like if I drop something and it hits the ground, how is it falling at two different rates, but at the same time, the same rate, right? Like what's allowing there to be continuity through experience, though we could be experiencing at different rates of the passage of time, right? So that was sort of this mind puzzle that I wrestled with. And ultimately what I came to the resolution of is the idea that, well, if we assume that there's a grandma relative to me and a me relative to grandma, and the grandma relative to me is experiencing time at the same rate I am, and there's a me relative to grandma that's experiencing time at the same rate she is, what you could basically have is there's basically an infinite series of me and an infinite series of her at a gradient of different rates of the passage of time, and there's a displacement of where I am in my timeline relative to her where she is in her timeline. Does that make sense? So essentially what the
Yeah.
equations do is calculate where I am relative to grandma and where she is relative to me in our distinctive timelines. And so that was basically it. And when I did this, I didn't think much of it other than one, wouldn't it be interesting if reality actually is that way? And two, the equations seem to account for it so that I could see that as a solution to how does this work, right? You see what I'm saying? And that was basically it until I'd say probably my junior year in college. I got exposed to special relativity in a mathematical, rigorous manner. Because I mean, everyone's seen like, pop science versions of these things, but it didn't really, I never put two and two together of that my equations for a subjective experience of time would have anything to do with the mathematics for measuring time dilation, right? But what happened is when I learned special relativity, what I saw is that in special relativity, the mathematics doesn't take into account a displacement of a stationary object because it's presumed since the object is stationary, its frame of reference isn't changing. But what my mathematics was showing that actually no, there's actually a temporal displacement for both, kind of like if you think about it, the moon's not going around the Earth. The Earth and the moon are both going around the center of mass. So in the same way, you could think of there's like a linear timeline, but when you have some sort of displacement that causes time dilation, all the objects have a time dilation, not just the moving one. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's like a center of time timeline that they've all displaced from, and albeit the one moving has the greatest time dilation, but what my mathematics was suggesting was even the ones not moving have a slight time dilation based on the fact that there was that relative movement. Does that make sense?
I'm trying my best to understand it, but you're saying it very clearly. So yeah, there's more time dilation for moving things, right? But there'd also be time dilation between two stationary beings if the one was old and
Yes,
one was young, also.
exactly. So for instance, with the twin, and what this has to do with is that my equations, when I actually understand what they're doing, are describing non-inertial frames of reference as opposed to inertial frames of reference, right? And the difference has to do with whether the body's accelerating or not. So my mathematics is strictly dealing with bodies that are accelerating. So there's an assumption that even if you're stationary, there's a slight acceleration taking place. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So if in the twin paradox experiment where you have Alice and Bob, excuse me, this thing's distracting me. With the twin paradox where you have Alice and Bob, the idea is that Alice stays here on Earth, so she stays in a non-relativistic frame. She doesn't move anywhere. And Bob gets into a rocket ship and takes off and goes at relativistic speeds. In so doing, Bob undergoes time dilation. So when he comes back, even though they were both the same age when he left, when he arrives, he's slightly younger because he went through time dilation and she's older, right? But what's interesting is that relativity doesn't adjust the timeline for Alice at all, and my equations do. So, if my equations do have any application to relativity, then what we should see is a situation where when Bob shows up, he's looking at his math and he's like, well, I'm later than I was supposed to be. And Alice looks at her watch and she says, actually, you've arrived early, meaning her calculations show him arriving later than he actually does, and his equations show him arriving earlier than he actually does. And so what my equations are doing is accounting for that, basically, technically, what would be called a Lorentz violation.
And what, with this being established, let's say, where do we go from it? What are the applications for this kind of breakthrough?
So what it would be is, if there's anything to this, then we would need to see examples of where there are things going faster. So let's say going faster than light, and relativity would say otherwise. And so one solid example that we have of that is that in a couple of the gravitational wave events that have been measured, the electromagnetic wave signal, the companion signal, arrived after the gravitational waves. And this is something that I predicted on a couple of YouTube videos, almost going back a decade, that if these equations are true, then this is what we would see. And so now that we've seen it, it's interesting because another part of this is that when you actually unpack the equations, in order to have these multiple timelines, you need to have multiple time dimensions, right? So when I unpack the Existics equations, when I'm applying them to time, what they're ultimately doing is describing 3 dimensions of time. So what's interesting is, okay, so what happens when we apply these 3 dimensions to conventional physics? And that's something that I've done, and there's quite a bit of use in doing that. Especially, one of the takeaways is that mass essentially ends up being temporal in nature, meaning what we consider to being mass is actually what you can think of as like a bundle of time, if anything.
A bundle of time. And yeah, so time is most fundamental, would you say, or energy as well? Like, what would be the most fundamental, basic elements or ingredients for understanding the nature of reality?
So what I have done is reduced it down to essentially just relationships between spatial and temporal coordinates. Now for me, and this is kind of interesting, for me, I think our entire concept of space is derived from our perceptions. And I think our entire concept of time could be arguably comes from either our sense of hearing or a combination thereof. But basically, our concept of sense and time, an analogy would be our senses of hearing and sight. Does that make sense? So for me, I think one of the mistakes we do with modeling the universe is the assumption that we occupy a 3-dimensional reality, when the fact of the matter is we're observing 3-dimensional perceptions and we don't know anything beyond that. Like, who's to say that the objects around us are not multidimensional, but the way we're hardwired, we have a 3-dimensional mapping of that multidimensional reality. And I think that that's a much more realistic basis to go by. So for me, it's not that space itself, or well, what is even space, right? If space is a modeling that our mind provides us so that we can navigate to whatever means we can within whatever this reality we are in is, right? Then there's your simulation, right? It's your perceptual mechanism. So I think physics makes a mistake of literalizing their perceptions and projecting that onto a hypothetical world outside themselves and literalize that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Um,
So for
so the
me, space and time are models. They're
right.
not, it's not a hardened reality. So I'm arguing we can understand not only space better with 3 dimensions like length, width, and height, but we can understand time better with 3 dimensions, and I label those as passage, periods, and present moments.
That's right. You mentioned this before we had this conversation.
Mhm.
Passage, periods, and what's the last one again?
Present
Present,
moments.
periods, present moments. Okay, break them down for me one more time. I think I remember, but I'd love to hear you describe it.
So So to kind of wrap your head around the concept of 2 dimensional time is actually quite easy. Let's say, let's see if I've got something drawn that might make that easy. If not, I could just whip something out. There we go, fair enough. Okay, so here's a piece of graph paper, right? And we can, actually, no, do I have a pen? I do not. Okay, so absent having a pen, imagine that the vertical lines, right? That those are present moments. And the horizontal lines are periods. So like, let's say this was this morning, and then this goes into the afternoon, and then we're going on into the evening, right? So as we go this way, we're progressing into the future, right? But at any given time, we're in a present moment. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So what we could do then is we could have a slope. Here we go. It's kind of hard with the mirror reflecting.
I know.
We could have a slope that, depending on the angle of the slope, is more periods per present moments. And so you could use that as a way to have faster and slower rates of time, right? But then you could have a vertical component to that, which would be a scaling factor, and you could have that as essentially passage. So you have periods and present moments as like a 2 dimensional plane, and then you can scale that up and down as faster and faster passage or lower and lower passage.
Okay, let me make sure I understand the difference between periods and present moments of time. Aren't periods always present moments of time?
Well, you can mentally go back and forth, but the way I like to do it is periods are sort of like sequential events. So if you were to look directly down the period coordinate, it would be like looking at one of those photographs of someone swinging a golf club, and you can see all the different moments of the swing all at the same time. So that's where you're seeing the past, present, and future all in a single moment, right?
Time
Or
lapse,
if you turn that 90 degrees, and you would be looking at like a still frame of one particular moment of the golf swing. Do you see what I'm saying? So if
Are
you
the
go ahead.
periods the many moments that you could see in a time lapse photograph?
Yes,
Okay, got
yes,
it.
those
Got
are the
it.
periods. And then each individual one extending in the opposite direction, in the 90-degree angle, those are your present moments.
Oh.
And so what that allows you to do is have a slope angle between periods and presents, and you can vary that slope angle as a way of varying the rate of time.
Okay, so that rate would be like the thing you're describing
Periods per
with,
present moments, yeah.
and that's like with your like a grandmother versus a baby experiencing time.
Exactly. Yep. And
Cool.
then you can use the passage component to also speed up or slow down time.
Cool. What
Do you see
what
what
have
I'm
you done
saying?
with? Yeah, I think I understand it now. Thank you for explaining. Okay, and you're beginning to discuss the next steps with this understanding. What are some other what are some applications of what we can do, what we measure and find out?
Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things about the existics equations is there's a temporal asymmetry inherent to the equations. And what that is as far as the standard use of the equations, Alice, right? Like when you have your proverbial Alice and Bob, Alice is always a greater value than Bob. So the numerator is always larger than the denominator, right? So the number on the top being divided by the number of the bottom is always greater, okay? And so there's this equivalence that happens in the equations where basically the it creates a triangle, right? So if you think about it, there's me relative to me, there's me relative to my grandma, there's my grandma relative to me, and there's my grandma relative to her. And so you could see those as temporal lengths that I could then arrange in the shape of a triangle. And that triangle would give me a conservation of time because I would always be able to use the Pythagorean theorem to derive those lengths at any given time. Does that make sense?
I mean, it seems to make sense. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So would this, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, because there's a lot for me to still learn. But so would this be useful for like anti-gravitic propulsion technology
I
calculations?
think so. Like, there's been times that, like, when I grew up and was younger, I was all into anti-gravity. And then as I got a little older, I kind of thought that it was more sort of like more of an electrostatic effect. You know what I mean? Like, and now as time's getting on, I'm getting more like, okay, yeah, I think we could actually, now that we're measuring gravitational waves and I'm looking at my own equations and how they apply to general relativity, the idea of microgravitational waves and things like that is very reasonable. So I think that's all reasonable, big time. Does that make sense? Like, it's not cuckoo to talk about that or research that stuff.
I agree. I think
Yeah.
it's, but I'm not a scientist, so I don't know how to exactly do it. But this does seem to be useful information if what you're saying is that mass is like a cluster of time, and if you want to like move things through time as a form of propulsion, you need to know all the dimensions necessary to make your calculations.
Right.
If you,
So,
yeah.
for instance, since there's that inherent asymmetry that I told you about, what's interesting is that if I let A and B, and this is a little technical, but I'll get there. If I let A and B be the same, I can still maintain that temporal displacement. So what's interesting is if you think about in quantum mechanics, if you think about particles, particles and antiparticles have a reverse time symmetry. So basically, the components are that charge and spin direction have the same symmetry as time reversal. So if you reverse the charge and the spin, it's the equivalent of a time reversal. So you can actually think of an antiparticle as a reverse time moving particle. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So for me, because of that temporal displacement, my argument is that matter actually is composed of particles and antiparticles simultaneously, but because there's this temporal displacement between them, they're never able to be at the same place at the same time simultaneously. Does that make sense? Because there's an inherent asymmetry that 3 dimensions of time brings into the situation. So what happens is the mystery of the negative matter, the negative energy in the Dirac equation, or why there's spectral lines with hydrogen atom, with why do the spectral lines split? There's a bunch of sort of strange things about quantum mechanics that if you actually just assume antimatter is in the picture because it's in the equations, there's no mystery. So for me, the idea then is that essentially half the particles in matter are reverse time antiparticles. Do you see what I'm saying? So the question of where's the missing antimatter? It's not missing. It's here. It's just going backwards in time. And because it's going backwards in time, it's able to couple with matter that's going forward in time. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you start to have that type of an understanding, when you get into material science and exotic uh, material behavior, right? That's where these things really start to apply and have have some interesting, applications.
And just a bit of a departure, but related.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I know you through Roy D. Herbert, and I think he referred to you as like a colleague. Have you guys collaborated on some work together?
We've interacted with each other quite a bit on X and in Spaces, and we both have come to very similar conclusions pertaining to time being multidimensional. And one very interesting thing is how he applies his concept of flow dynamics with passage of time, and that's essentially what curvature is. That's the same thing as what I have, but he has it in his way and I have it in mine. So it's nice when you find two different ways of coming to the same conclusion, because then obviously what you want to do is take those equations and set them equal to each other and see what drops out. And so
And
there's been
how
some
much have
very
you compared your equations so far
well, he
together?
talks a lot about the Klein-Gordon equation, and I've been going back and looking at. There are some interest. Here's what's really interesting. When I bring my what I call temporal mechanics, so temporal mechanics is the existics equations applied to physics. Okay,
That's so cool. I'm going to write that
so
down too.
yeah, so I
I
just
love,
call it
you,
temporal mechanics.
you, that's your terminology, temporal
Well,
mechanics.
that word's floated around, but I've never seen it. That phrase has been around, like it's on Star Trek and stuff, but I've never seen anyone truly formalize it. So
Oh,
since I had actual formalizations of temporal mechanics, it's like, all right, this is temporal mechanics. Plus, if anybody else comes up with any temporal mechanics, it's going to be consistent. And Herbert's an example of that. He's an example of that. So
yeah,
that's
yeah,
what we like is like, look, hey,
yeah. It's a
independent.
yes, yeah, independent, different,
Hmm.
way approaches, it's the same results, or and okay, so his I'm going to butcher this, but hydrotemporal, is that how he describes it? And you, he has the hydro thing, and what's your thing instead? How would you describe
Well,
the
with
differences again?
mine, I find okay. So go back to the three dimensions of time. So you've got periods and present moments, making that two-dimensional plane, right? Right, like
Yep,
so we
the
we
graph
have
paper. Yeah,
periods and present, right? Or we could rotate it in present periods, either way, right? But that's what these coordinates are made up of. So what it is I'm going to turn this way, and now I've got a coordinate that's vertical, right? So let's say I have some kind of an event that takes place like this. Well, if I turn it like this, I can elevate that and have it go faster, right? So this is passage. So what's interesting is that Roy's using two dimensions of time. I'm using three. And it's trying to figure out, you know, because I can look at like Newtonian mechanics and see three-dimensional time implied in all kinds of places, but Newton wasn't thinking that way, but he's naturally having to operate that way. Like for instance, with acceleration, the coordinates have the units times squared. Well, what is that? What does it mean for time to be squared? So if space squared gives us an area, then shouldn't we have a concept of an area of time? Doesn't that make sense? So in temporal mechanics, that's a moment. So one of these little squares here would be a moment. Does that make sense?
hmm
With dimensions of periods and present, right? And then you can give it depth, and that's passage. But if I give it a negative sign, I can substitute that in for mass. So that's why I'm saying mass can be reduced to being components of temporal. Mass could be reduced to being composed of temporal components. Does that make sense?
yeah. I
Therefore,
mean, it lines up with a
yeah.
lot of research I've been attempting to wrap my head around in terms of what I call open source energy, which is
Yeah.
the perhaps forgotten, but allegedly suppressed Tesla-like ideas and such. But with propulsion and things like that, it all seems to make sense to me, and it's cool to hear it coming from different angles and with
So you're
different
into
types.
the UFO stuff, right?
I am. I mean, I have a open-minded. I attempt to have a scientific approach to all these
Right.
things. So I'm not like a believer. I'm not an experiencer.
Hmm.
I've seen some things from a distance so far. I'm contemplating to what extent maybe I want to get more personal with these encounters. But I sort of like that about me, that I can that I have not been so haven't been abducted or abused or swept away or possessed. So it's my point of view is one that's just looks at the data, and there
Hmm.
seems to be a lot of mystery to resolve one way or another, whatever it might be. Yeah. How about you? You've experienced some things. You mentioned some early like paranormal type things, right?
Hmm.
And
So
can you?
for
Yeah.
me,
What?
yeah.
Please continue.
So for me, like I was raised Christian and stuff, and I don't know, it, paranormal was not a weird thing in my upbringing. And in the time, when I was a kid in the late 80s and 90s, that wasn't strange stuff. Like I have the Time Life series, Mysteries of the Unknown. You know what I mean? Like, so it was commonplace really to have experiences, to know people to have experiences. It's pretty, that's pretty standard. Human beings have the ability to have internal spiritual experiences or even external experiences that go beyond, you know, the ability to just explain it in a mundane way, right? Um, but as far as UFOs and stuff, that's something that I've seen a lot of. In fact, it was something where when I was younger, I knew where there were hot spots. Friends and I would go see these things. And a lot of this stuff I've always associated with the military, breakaway, uh, like breakaway contracting groups, things like that. That like my dad, for a while was the director of marketing for Lockheed Martin out of Norton Air Force Base, and he worked building. He built drone aircraft back in the 80s to be tested out at a island just south of Catalina Island where there's a Navy test facility. His dad was NTSB, and when I was a kid, gave me a piece of the YF-117 and said, Gavin, UFOs are real, but they're all ours. So I grew up fully exposed and understanding that there are clandestine aircraft things, weapons capabilities, things that are totally outside the public's purview, and also observing things in nature that are not that. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a very like people that are very familiar with this landscape can really easily tell, okay, that's like what people would want to call blue beam tech, or that's actually drone tech, or those are actually paratroopers with flares, because there's actually a lot of psyop that goes around this stuff. Like I could get into, I could even show you military getting caught faking UFO stuff, and so there's like all kinds of layers to this landscape. You know what I mean?
I do. Yeah.
So I'm familiar with a lot of that stuff. Even to where I've seen things that I think people would say, oh, that has to be aliens. But I would argue that I think those are what people would call earth lights. The plasma balls coming out of mountains and stuff. Like,
Hmm.
you know what I mean? So I've seen a lot that, this is like,
Yeah.
I don't really talk about this stuff, but these are things that I've seen experience quite a bit. So when I was, younger and not raising kids and stuff, spent a lot more time dabbling.
It's never too late to get back into it, man. I know you have a million projects, but we are searching for the nature of reality. So this to me
Yeah.
is the biggest mystery of all time. It pertains to your science, I think, and philosophy. And yeah, and you've had more experiences than I have, although I have been talking to all kinds of people, and I have all kinds of invitations to experience things
Yeah,
with
if
them.
you
And
know where
yeah.
to, like, it's one of those things where, it's like the beach that has no lifeguard with the sign that says no lifeguard on duty, swim at your own risk.
Right.
You know, be careful, you may end up getting what you ask for with this, because this stuff is it's real.
Well, I'm really excited to have
Yeah.
Chris Bledsoe on the podcast pretty soon. Are you familiar who that is?
Mm-mm.
Oh, he has a #1 New York Times best-selling book called, I think, UFO of God. I got to know him at Contact in the Desert, where I lectured on my philosophy, which we can talk about later, and how it relates to this topic in particular. And Chris Bledsoe was there just to kind of vibe. But yeah, he's how do you even tell this story? Yeah, he experiences things in a way that has caught the attention of, I guess, intelligence agencies of the entire world. But this time they're letting it be public. They're making some sort of major motion picture with a top director. I'm not allowed to know who it is yet, but I think I have a guess. And then they're also making 2 major documentaries about him. Like he was able to release this book, and it's all the more the light and love side of the coin. He's has claims that seem pretty backed up, that through these experiences of orbs and the lady, you might have heard of the lady from many different cultures throughout all of history and mythology, the lady who's this seemingly benevolent non-human being of some kind, I guess, who comes out of orbs and things like that. And anyway, yeah, he could just summon them. I was at Contact, and he could just summon them, orbs and things, or I don't know. People don't have to say summon, manifest them is more friendly, right? And so, but it's been only positive things, and there was sort of this cult kind of forming around him. It doesn't seem to be his intention. He's a wonderful man. I mean, I got this brilliant, wonderful, cool guy, and I can understand why maybe it's a mystery as to why we're allowed to talk about disclosure this much, and why it's been coming out in the politics and the congressional things, and why people like Chris Bledsoe is allowed to be out in public and sort of exalted by pop culture, publishing.
Wouldn't it be funny if really what it is there's just been classified patents that are going to run out at a certain point, and because those patents ultimately go public, that's when, because to me, I think there's kind of, my opinion, I don't know everything, right? But my opinion is there's a lot of convolution between military intelligence, secret technology, and the paranormal
Oh
that
yeah.
actually does not overlap. Do you know what I'm saying? Where I would argue that they sometimes like to use their secret technology to mirror paranormal behavior to psyop people.
Oh
Do you
yes,
know what
and
I'm saying?
there's a lot of evidence of this happening.
And a friend of mine and I had an experience like that I would have never talked about because it just sounds crazy. But what it was is, back in the 90s, you got to remember they were still denying the existence of Area 51. So there were a time period when some of us, when we were in our late teens and early 20s, we were adventurous. You know what I mean? And sometimes when you're adventurous, the adventure follows you home, and the adventure wants to leave a memory that you never come back, right? So what better thing to do than scare the crap out of people with fancy technology that if you didn't know otherwise, you think you're being attacked by some kind of a alien thing, but at the same time, why is there a white van wherever this thing is? And then later on, some guys that work at the base joke with you and say, yeah, we used to do that. Those were basically a drone tech we can't talk about, and the operator's in the van. And it's just, keep you guys from sticking your nose in our business.
Yeah, it makes a lot
You
of
know what I mean?
sense.
So there's a lot of this that is them mirroring that as smoke, right? But that you separate from what's actually real. And what's real, in my opinion, is far beyond our ability to mimic it. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, and I
But
think that
at the
that
same
aligns up.
time, our ability to do very advanced things that if they've been kept from us for 50 years would look alien, I think we're very capable of that as well. So
Yeah, that definitely lines up with my I assume that that's at least some of it. And as we get closer and closer, hopefully it won't happen, but to full on World War III, where I mean, there's always a need to have your technology ahead of the other, superpowers, right? And we are on the brink of World War III. We're already in the sort of sort of early stages of it. It seems. Let's not be depressed about it, though. I'd say we're going to just focus on the science and the theories. But yeah, it seems, for all nations of the world, especially ours, right, that it would make sense that they would want to get these. They have the triangle craft. They've had them for a while. They have these much more high tech UAPs. And they want to use them and test them in the field, and they want to use it to spy. I mean, imagine if you have a fully reconstructed or just created UAP that can be invisible, that can skip through time essentially, and go on. It's a great tool for spying on your adversary, but it's still emerging technology, and you probably don't have all the kinks worked out. So just in case it happens
No,
to be
right?
detected by.
Yeah, so what if you've got stuff that, like, here's one for you. What if there are things that are useless in the theater, but are very effective for psychological operations and are exotic? Do you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? Like something that, sure, it's using gravitational propulsion, things like that, but we can't stick somebody in the damn thing, but we sure can, do this on a small scale and scare the crap out of our enemy. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's why I think some of it, I honestly, I think it's going to be real interesting to see what disclosures we end up getting as we get closer to like a World War scenario. Disclosures on actual military tech they've been hiding. I think that's going to become interesting. And
I
I
don't think
think
they're going
what
to
the
give us that
UA
disclosure, right? Unless it's like catastrophic. I had a whistleblower. Oh, you were listening in that space, Jason Sands, for example. He
Mhm.
seems to be the first whistleblower. Guys, check out the space. I'll put it in the comments. Oh, hey, Woo Writers. DG, good to see you. Can you hear okay? It's okay though. Guest audio. Okay, we have a little bit of audio feedback. Thank you, Woo Writers. We appreciate you. I'm loud enough. There's a request. If you could turn your mic level up just a hair.
It's probably from me leaning back. Is that better?
I hear you okay, but if you have like a gain like knob or something, it's something to
I really
consider.
don't. I'm just going off the computer mic.
Oh, okay, then that's probably what it is. Yeah. Okay. Well, let us know, Woo Writers, if this is better now that he's leaning in for a close up.
Hmm.
But yeah, what you're saying is all definitely one component, at least, if not the whole thing. The consciousness being the sort of nexus between the technology and the spirituality, and so yeah, and for a while, another theory has been that, for me anyway, that they're trying to not get people to focus on the consciousness side for the reasons you're describing. It appears to be used in the sometimes in both the propulsion and the sort of navigation of these craft, allegedly, but also for these psyop experiments and deceptions, to get people away from what they're actually doing, and to focus instead on question mark, right? That this is alien, that these are, creatures, this is out of this world, to be scared, but don't suspect the United States or whoever else might also be doing the same
I
tricks.
think the real issue with the consciousness is that it's really hard to control the public when they're able to really dive deep into the inner layers of their own self. Like, a lot of people don't ever take the time to really explore their inner nature and learn the different levels of experience that you can have inside. Like, not just not only can you hear yourself talking to yourself all day, right? Your inner
Mhm.
critic, right? Your Jiminy Cricket. And not only can you have dreams, and not only can you have vivid dreams, and not only can you have like visions, and not only can you have deja vu, but you can have lucid dreaming. You can have deeper levels of lucid dreaming. You can keep pushing that to the point where you can start to have out of body experiences, and then realms of which I myself haven't even explored, because honestly, a lot of this stuff is extremely intense. Um, for anyone who's had what's called an out of body experience, and that's what it is, because when you experience it, you're like, this has to be it, because there's nothing else that could describe this, right? It's a much more real I don't know, it feels more real than our sensory experience. Does that make sense? To where
It
when
does.
you
Yeah.
come back to to using your eyes, ears, and sense of touch, it's clear that that is a muted version of what that other experience is. Like, it's extremely clear. So that's what I mean by you can really have a much deeper, more meaningful experience as a human through inward direction, right? And so I think a lot of the reasons why they don't like people studying or getting to understand, they want to make it this giant mystery. What's consciousness? It's like, oh, you are a consciousness. That's the mystery. That's why God's name is I am. Because if you sit there and think about it long enough, you'll realize you are the very thing experiencing that moment right now in the place where you are, and that is you and one and the same. And once you have that self recognized realization, you're self aware. You're aware of yourself because you're having that self sensory experience. And I think that's what makes human beings kind of unique, and then to take that experience further, right? So that's my take on that.
Yeah, yeah, I like how you break it down so simply. I mean, we have a lot of discussions that you've participated in, some of them about consciousness, and it is fundamental, and yeah, it does go to source or God, whatever people want to refer to it in their tradition. Um, okay, we can dance around a little bit now because I have so many things I want to talk to you about, like your new internet. Is that okay? Or do you want to hit more on the science and philosophy first before we
Yeah,
talk
we'll
about
just
your
talk about
revolution?
this stuff. Yeah, because that's a whole nother.
No, right?
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Okay, we'll in due course. Yeah, yeah, we won't get
Mm-hmm.
greedy. We'll just take it one step at a time. Okay, so you're just explaining the similarities and slight differences between the work you do and the work that Roy D. Herbert does. Okay, so we're talking about the phenomena and your
Oh, so
experiences
let's
with
go
it. Yeah.
back to the Roy thing. So remember, we have periods of time horizontally and then present moments, right? So that each square represents a moment in time, right?
Mhm.
And we can change the angle of inclination and change the rate of the passage of time that way,
Is that
right?
like a frame rate in filmmaking? Would you
Yeah,
say?
that's exactly it. That's a perfect analogy. Um, or we could go vertically up and down and change the rate that way as a third dimension, a third component, right? So that vertical component in relation to that flat plane has an inversely proportional relationship, is what I end up finding as I play with my math and as I find the equivalence of my equations with what's already standard. Something that comes out of it is that the passage of time has an inverse proportional relationship with periods of time. Now, why this is interesting is that the equations will take the same form as thermodynamics. So I can bring in the, the equations for entropy. And so then, with like my model of the atom, where I have particle disintegration, then reverse time particle anti-disintegration, right? So that a particle, like a hydrogen atom, the electron orbiting the the proton is actually the electron orbiting the proton, um, going forward in time, backwards in time, forward in time, backwards in time, reversing through particle antiparticle phases. Does that make sense?
I believe so.
Okay. So I'm going back and forth in time. Like now picture like a time loop. So in the loop, I'm going forward in time, slowing down backwards in time, then reversing, and I'm going forward in time, backwards in time through a loop. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So that's the same thing as like a thermal loop, like that you would use with like a air conditioner, let's say. So what does the thermal loop in an air conditioner do? It takes the heat, absorbs it into the coolant, and then expels it out the radiator, right? And it's able to maintain the same temperature inside the refrigerator as it's kicking out heat out of the back of the unit. So that works as an analogy for a time loop where it's time, linear time, that's radiating out of the time loop, just as heat radiates out of a thermal loop. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It's
So
trippy. I
that's how
like
you
it.
can have time loops, like particles being in a time loop, but still having entropy with time flowing in one direction. And
Mm.
what facilitates that with the three dimensions of time is going back to that asymmetry I mentioned with the existics equations. So that asymmetry in the existics equations, as it carries through into the applications of physics through three dimensions of time into thermodynamics, allows for there to be repeating time loops and a forward moving direction of time.
Okay, I got a question. It's
Sure.
somewhat related from one of our. I'll put it on the screen from one of our friends on YouTube, Blue Writers. Question is, how? Oh, you can hear. Okay, how influential was Mr. Harold Brown for Gavin's career?
Extremely. So what it was is I got into the master's degree program at the philosophical. So the Philosophical Society created a master's degree in consciousness program that I was a student in, and Harold Dean Brown was one of the professors that was involved in that program. And the way I got into that program was I submitted my Existics document, the one you've probably seen, the Existics 101. I submitted that document and another math document. And Dean took a liking to me because of those documents, and me and him basically had like a student mentor relationship that went beyond the coursework. So basically, I lived in Southern California, he lived up in the Bay Area, and I would visit him quite often. And we were really good friends and spoke probably an average of 8 hours a week for about a year and a half.
What? Where did you study with Harold Brown?
The It was the University of Philosophical Research, and it was hosting a consciousness study program. It was put on by an individual named Jeff Mishlove. If you look up Jeffrey Mishlove, you can actually see some of the faculty that were part of the program. And a lot of the individuals that associate with Jeffrey, and some of which were part of the Consciousness Studies program, were involved with SRI and the Stargate program back in the 70s up into the 90s.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. And Dean was part of the Stargate program, so that was interesting.
I'm reading up on this. Yeah. Wow. Perhaps if I get another degree, it will be in the same type of subjects. It's so fascinating to me. Thanks for the question, Wu, who has been following all the podcast episodes so far, and I appreciate you, man. Okay, so what more? Okay, I don't let me rush you, but what's the next thing I should understand about your philosophy of science?
That I have so I've got a YouTube channel with a lot of videos, and my videos I've made some recent ones, but you'll see there's literally a decade of me not making any videos. And what that is I made a bunch of predictions mathematically in those videos that now, 10 years later, I have results for. So, if anything, without having to get too deep into any of that unless you want to, the takeaway is that I have a model that to argue that time is better understood through three dimensions. So essentially, something very interesting is having to start to think about time three-dimensionally, just as we think of space three-dimensionally, rather than it being a single time dimension. And what's bizarre is when you see how many problems in physics disappear immediately just by bringing in the extra time components. Almost as if a lot of these modern problems in physics are artifacts of limiting time to just one dimension.
Got it. Um, if it's not too much of a departure, can we get into your general thoughts on the nature of the universe, or what is the greater construct? Do you think the Big Bang is something of credibility? Is that a real theory? What are, in terms of what has been observed by the James Webb Telescope? What is your current guesstimation about the construct of reality?
Sure. So, with my model, one of the ideas was when I looked at what's called the particle soup, and it's basically all the decay modes of all the different particles that have ever been observed, right? The thing that stands out to me is why is it that we have this huge like categories and catalogs of all these different variations of particles that last for fractions of a moment, and the universe is composed of just a handful of particles that don't disintegrate? To me, that just is extremely unnatural. And so what I started playing with was the idea that what if what we consider matter is actually the same thing as what we're seeing breaking into a million pieces, but what matter is those decays captured in some sort of a cycle or a loop so that they actually don't decay. Does that make sense? So what I did was, could I take the decay modes of all the different particles and point them at one another and create stable structures such that if I put it in a time loop, that's actually what matter is. And what's real easy is if I just take, like, for instance, beta decay. So what's beta decay? Beta decay is a neutron decaying into a proton, an electron, and an antineutrino, right? Well, if I take an antineutrino and I decay it, I'm going to get an antiproton, a positron, and a neutrino. So what I can do is I can have a reverse time anti-beta decay, and it looks like beta decay going backwards. So if I just put those in a loop, hypothetically, right, then what that does is the hydrogen atom is actually beta decay caught in a loop. So the electron orbiting the proton is trying to decay, but because it's caught in a time loop, it's hydrogen. Does that make sense?
I mean, as much as I can wrap my head around these things, it's a great idea. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
You see what I'm saying? So
So,
there's an
yeah.
inherent unstableness to stable reality that if you take the instability and point it in the right way,
Mhm,
it's what makes it stable. So basically, there's
mhm.
stable configurations of matter and unstable configurations of matter. And one argument could be that the reason why all the radioactive particles tend to have a left-handed spin is because these stable configurations have a right-handed spin. And they'd say, oh, well, we're not observing right-handed particles. Yeah, because they're not radiating away. You see what I'm saying? And you can play with this when you get into the reversibility between charge, parity, and time. You know what I'm saying? And there's ideas where you can actually have a quantum probability distribution involving both forward and reverse time, and that's what my maths essentially do, right?
So,
So
does this work fractally in terms of you're talking about like small
okay, so
materials and
what's
how they,
interesting about the fractal situation is that
rebuffering? I think. Oh, you're
is
back.
that
Yeah.
better? Okay.
Yeah, you're back now. Cool.
All right, so let's go back to the the me and grandma, right? So there's me relative to me, grandma relative to me relative to grandma, and grandma relative to herself, right? What were we just talking about?
Grandma relative to herself. That's another
Yeah,
level of
yeah,
complexity.
but
Yeah.
right before that. Oh,
Oh,
okay.
oh, the fractal
Yeah,
aspect because
yeah,
you're talking about
exactly.
how. Yeah.
So in order for this to work, I need to have a continuum of a bunch of different me's all going at different rates of the passage of time. And I just so happen to be at one of those rates, right? And then there's a me going at a faster rate of the passage of time, and that's the one interacting with grandma. And then there's a grandma that's going at a slower rate of the passage of time, and that's the one interacting with me. So in order to calculate where we are in relation to one another, I need to calculate for that infinite series of relative frames of reference in between one another, because no matter the distance in time we're displaced, there's going to be an infinite series of possible variations in between, right? So that's where the fractalization is. So the way I account for this is by using a set of what are called continued fractions, where you just keep repeating the fraction over and over and over again, like an iteration. Similar to how in fractal equations, they just keep looping the answer back into the quotient of the equation, just keep processing it again and again, like through an iterative process. But what's interesting is that there's an equivalence that I can do and a substitution and simplify the equation so I don't have to actually carry it out infinitely. But that fractalization is there.
So with the conservation of time and energy, would this relate to it both in the tiny sort of elemental like scale of how entropy pointed at each other turns into sort of what we refer to as matter? Would the same thing sort of apply in terms of how we have a bigger system where the energy and the time is conserved ultimately?
Yeah, I would say yes, and I think an example of where I'm demonstrating that is, so let's go back to the Big Bang. Um, so realize as soon as I have a working model of the atom, where, because if you think about it, if I'm assuming that hydrogen is composed of beta decay caught in a loop, then I actually have a probability of there not being a sort of a null set, if that can actually make sense, of it emerging. So it's sort of like a fountain where you have a particle coming into existence and going out of existence simultaneously, but it can't tell whether it's coming or going, so it's stuck in a loop. Does that make sense? Like, did I just come into existence or am I going out of existence? Right? Like, you're so much on that cusp that it's not differentiable. And I call that, the term I use for that is identity crisis, right?
To be or not to be,
Yeah, yeah.
yin yang. What
Yeah,
else?
so the at the fundamental basis of my model, I have what I call an identity crisis, and it's basically your basic unit stuck in a loop of coming and going, because if it went in, it would collapse the probability of it going out, and if it went out, it would collapse the probability of it going in. So it's stuck in sort of like a static state of coming and going. Does that make sense?
Does,
Okay.
yeah.
So in order to do that, I have to have an in and an out. Does that make sense? Kind of like electrical current. So
Mhm.
there's got to be an inflow and an outflow. But the inflow and the outflow have to have a forward and a reverse time component. So there's a forward inflow and a reverse forward inflow, an outflow and a reverse outflow. Does that make sense?
I believe so. I mean, it defies what my brain can really understand. But yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Right?
Theoretically, it makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So if I've got that and it works, the problem is, well, now I have matter emerging out of the vacuum rather than emerging from a single event. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's basically like a soft form of creation that happens over time through a probability of a potential versus all at once.
Mhm.
Do you see what I'm saying? So let's hold that thought. So then, if we look at three dimensions of time and we look at the equations for galactic for cosmic redshift, meaning the fact that the further we look out, the redder the light spectrum shifts, right? So if we look at that, there's a classic model. It's kind of ironic. The person that discovered dark matter, his name was Fritz Zwicky. He came up also with this idea of tired light. And his idea is that it's not that the universe is expanding, it's just that the light is losing energy as it travels through space. But as we got more sophisticated, and because of conservation laws and the fact that the vacuum doesn't couple with light in a way that would do what he would make that happen, then basically that idea doesn't work. But what's interesting, if I bring three dimensions of time in, I can actually have the rate of the passage of time decrease over the history of the universe, so that the farther out in time, the farther out in space you look, the slower the rate of the passage of time. Now, what's crazy is that was recently observed, I think a year ago. So that's a prediction I made 10 years ago that's been observed. So realize the further out you look in space, the slower everything starts to move. Okay? So that being the case, what that means is I can have light redshift without an expanding universe. So if I can have light redshift without an expanding universe, and if I can have matter emerge out of the vacuum through quantum fluctuations, then I don't need a Big Bang.
Yeah.
So if I don't need a if there is or isn't, my model isn't dependent on that. Do you get what I'm saying? It goes
Mhm.
either way.
Right.
But if there is no Big Bang, then what's interesting is that both dark matter and dark energy can be accounted for also with three dimensions of time. And that's actually a really easy one. The argument being the reason why the galactic rotations, there's basically there's a flat line that happens where the velocities are essentially all going the same, where no matter how far out you go, the orbital velocity is essentially the same. Do you get what I'm saying? So it's not like the whole thing's spinning like a big pizza, but it's that the velocity is not tapering off as you would expect with Newton's equations. Like it's not bleeding off at 1 over r squared. It flattens out, right? So the idea is, okay, there has to be more matter out there. Frank Wilczek more appropriately says it's more of an acceleration issue than a matter issue because we're not seeing anything. My argument is that the rate of the passage of time is decreasing as you get further away from the galactic center. So because time is going by faster at a slightly higher rate, the further you get out from the galactic center, the faster time's going. So that's what's giving it that appearance of moving faster than it should according to Newtonian mechanics. Or with dark energy, the universe appearing to be expanding or accelerating as it expands, that's just an aspect of the rate of the passage of time decreasing over the age of the universe, which has been observed. So basically, and then the third one is since the gravitational waves are arriving prior to light, since gravity arrives from the same source before light does, then that means the gravitational waves are not experiencing gravitational redshift, cosmic redshift. Do you see what I'm saying? So basically, the bottom line is there's evidence for three dimension of time that shows that there is no Big Bang, that basically probably what the cosmic microwave background is that light can only travel 13.8 billion years, and then it recouples back with the vacuum. And so basically, optically, all we can do is see 13.8 billion years out. But with gravitational waves, since gravity's not coupling with the light, as evidenced by the gravitational waves arriving sooner, then we could actually use gravitational wave detectors to make observations beyond the cosmic microwave background.
So you're leaning towards there not being a Big Bang, and if it's not a
That it's an
origin,
even bigger structure. That it's
yeah.
that there's even that the scale gets more and more and more.
Mhm. So how would you guess? So you emphasize the importance of consciousness, and you explain it succinctly,
Mm-hmm.
and you come from a religious background, and spirituality seems intrinsically linked to theories related to consciousness and its essential nature, brought into
Mm-hmm.
the perhaps mythology, maybe actual truths, passed down from generation to generation, that perhaps consciousness is what came first. I think, and I'm sorry if I get this wrong, but our friend Roy was saying in one of our recent spaces that he thinks of consciousness being more of an emergent property. Same thing with maybe time, but consciousness. What do you think? What came first? Was consciousness? Did it exist before what we consider objective reality, matter, and things of that nature? Or did consciousness emerge over time through this sort of evolution of particles and emergence of things smashing together, leading to more advanced beings that are capable, like us and trees and maybe many other things, with having the spark of consciousness?
For me, the real giveaway is in the Aramaic Christian Judeo uh, religious background. The concept of the name of God being, sorry, God's name being I am that I am, or more appropriately, first person present tense of the verb to be. Um, I think there is very deep understanding there, and I don't think enough people really reflect on that. Like, for instance, if you think of just the concept that we are made in God's image, well, so are you saying if I self reflect that I am peering into the direction of the face of God? Is you see, so what ends up happening is that our own identity is wrapped up with the location through which we self reflect, and in doing so, have an experience that is a religious experience to such an extent that ancient shamanic traditions, all the way up to all the ones we're familiar with, all kind of do the same thing, and that is attribute, whether you want to call it God, the source, or whatever, this thing is being, meaning just being. And if you stop and think about it, does being ever seem to go away? No, it's kind of always there, similar to the present moment, right? Like, notice now is not now, even though it's still now. And those were three different moments, yet there was this thing that lingered. And consciousness is the same. So for me, the problem is that we're trying to project into, see, here's the mistake is this. We're assuming that we are in the world we're observing, when the reality is we are not in the world we're observing. We're observing a world, and we, the thing making that observation, is outside of it looking in. And what you're looking into at best is a perceptual reflection at best. So you're not in that thing. It's actually maybe in you, but is it in you? Because when you look in a mirror and you're seeing a reflection, is that an accurate representation of what you are? Or is that just a perceptual analog that you have to work with? Do you get what I'm saying? So the reality is, we're constantly trying to account for consciousness with the tools of perception, when the irony is is that consciousness is the driver, not the object of observation. So you can't describe it. It's the thing doing the describing. You can't point at it. It's the thing doing the pointing. So it's this ironic thing that it just is and we just are. And that's just the way it is. And that's all there is to it. But when we don't get that, we look for it past it, which isn't it. So it's a
Yeah.
mystery, right?
I made some art about this called introspection. It's an animated thing. I'll show it to you guys at some point. But yeah, you'll see it's a person with the face kind of sliced off, looking into a mirror, and then it was an animation between the face kind of emerging from the mirror and looking back at the blank face and like a mirror. Anyway, trippy stuff. But yes, I have thought about these things, and I agree with the way you describe it. And yeah, so with all that said, would you say that this consciousness would be the thing that came first, or was there no first in this?
There
This
is
is
no
the
coming first if you just are. Coming is an action which requires temporal extension, meaning a beginning and an end point.
right. Well, beginning and end. How about like birth and death?
Yeah,
After death,
but
what?
consciousness
Yeah,
doesn't have beginning or ending. It just is. It doesn't. Consciousness is perpetually in the present moment. It's never in the past. It's never in the future. And even if we want to make arguments from studying sensory input and make the case that we perceive time after it's happened because of the nature of signaling, even if you want to go into that, you're still only perceiving the present time relative to you, which might slightly be in the past relative to your senses. But that's two different timelines. That's two different time dimensions, right? And so you're always in this present moment. And that's why to me it's funny because when you get it, you've got it, and there's no explanation because it just is. And trying to explain it, you're just dancing around it because it just is. You just are. There is no
but is it? But
explaining
is it eternal
consciousness.
for us? I know it's always the now moments. It's what I refer to in my philosophy as the eternal present tense. So I'm
Well, let me
vibing with
ask you this. Are you here now?
currently, yes, always currently.
Is it still now?
It's always now.
So there's the answer to your question. I think the problem is we think, well, what about when I die? The question, what I would say is you know what? There's a conservation of consciousness. Now, what happens to that
Something like
when
that.
you die?
Mm.
Who the hell knows? And good luck figuring that out because that's on the other side. But it doesn't make sense that it comes and goes because it is. Do you understand? Like,
Mm.
because how does something come from nothing? It can't.
Can't, right? Yeah, it's impossible. It seems. Yeah.
So how can consciousness be an emergent phenomena?
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to bring Roy into the next one so you
Well,
can fight it out. But yeah,
but see, here's where we get into the paradox of the linguistics of even trying to describe it. Because even though from my position I could be correct, he could come in with a counter argument that's also correct. And what's interesting is that's actually what existics is capturing and describing is that very thing that can't be described and why it can't be described. Because what it is there's Gavin's frames of reference, there's Roy's frames of reference, and when I'm describing something that's non-physical in my frame of reference, he may be referring to the physical aspect of that same thing in his frame of reference. So the reason why there appears to be a contradiction or a conflict is because we're describing polar aspects of the same thing. Do you follow?
yeah. I mean, it's all relative to, our, the experience through time, and what I refer to as the coherence narrative of our now moments of the eternal present tense, in our choices and our way of framing it, and telling our own sort of personal
Like
narrative.
I've got kids, so they didn't exist at one point, and now they're here, they're conscious. So that's where one could make the argument, well, it emerged from somewhere, right? But from my kid's frame of reference, all he's ever known is being. And my argument is those are two separate frames of reference.
All right, you're a genius in my humble
Do you
opinion.
get what I'm
So
saying though? Do you see
I
how
think so, yeah.
like those are, yeah.
Oh, but let's figure out what happens post life, right? The conservation of consciousness, as you said, seems to be, it'd be very odd if things just stopped existing. So we can seemingly, right, view people as they pass away, and there are possible technologies, EKG, whatever else, to there's DMT and all these clues as to what's going on with the chemical aspects of the brain and body as the final earthly moments pass, seemingly in the eternal present tense of now moments, of course. But for those of us who remain, there like there's been movies about this, about like what's going on, Frankenstein, all the way to Flatliners and things. So you're a mad genius. I know you got a lot of projects, but can you help us crack this one? Like, how would we go about it?
I don't think we can make consciousness.
Oh, I'm not suggesting we should, but what happens to what we call consciousness after we die? And can we find out how it's potentially conserved somehow through some sort of observable data points? Or I know it's probably beyond us, but
it's not in this, like, for me, where our consciousness is outside space and time. Because it's persistent, and space and time are not. Space and time are dynamic. This thing is persistent, such that it was even like God's name is persistence, right? Being. We're just going to call God being because it's the thing that never goes away, right? So it doesn't go away. Now, what do we experience after death? That's up for argument, but I would say that persistence remains in our frame of reference. Now, obviously, when we die, our body's, dead and we're disconnected from it. But I think we're still being. Do you understand what I mean? Like, because if you think about it, there's obviously, let's say there's obviously an ancient past, right? And there's obviously an infinite future. So why is it that I just so happen to be right now? Because that being right now would have been the same no matter where along that timeline I am.
Right, persistence.
So that's why I'm saying it's just persistent. It's the persistent thing that we experience. That's consciousness.
For sure. And I'm a little biased, but I love, when my graduate school training and, work I've done as a filmmaker and screenwriter and such comes into play with these mind-blowing theories and philosophies, like persistence of vision, something as a filmmaker, like persistence of vision is the invention of cinema, right? And I'm also an animator. I sort of I do a fine art approach to animation, which is rather time consuming because I hand draw and often paint every frame. And I've experimented with the persistence vision, the frame rate, all these things, and I like more deeply than anyone I've ever considered. And my philosophy, in part, came from these meditations on the eternal present tense in these infinitely sliceable now moments. Each one I sort of I do it in this kind of moving, self-created and reflected upon Rorschach, where I would not really plan out what I was doing and be in this eternal flow state, which is related to this concept I have called the eternal present tense. It's all my personal experiences in trying to improve my own life, or to make it at least function, so I can survive without, limiting my ethics or integrity, philosophy, right? As I look at it. So yeah, it's cool. So I'm really loving how, again, persistence comes in, the consciousness you say is persistent, unlike a time and other things are dynamic. And so I'm looking at the definition of dynamic, makes you obviously constant change, whereas persistence is sort of this obstinance of not changing.
Mm-hmm.
And now you always give me so many, Roy, or always inspire me to make art, which is great because it's my way of trying to understand this stuff. And it's fun to make pictures. You're a filmmaker, you're an artist, you get it,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a cool design aesthetic. I like you, man, with your names. I mean, I see it. There's an artistic side to what you do, and I think any great philosophy, it is an art form.
Well,
So
there's an artistic aspect to, like, what's funny is a lot of when I first started Existics was kind of more from an artistic point of view because it was mostly about frames of reference and perspective. Because what I found is that when you really focus in on perspective and your frame of reference, you can actually differentiate yourself from what you're observing in a very sort of intimate, fundamental way. And one person who I found that really captured a lot of that was Goethe, especially with Goethe's color wheel and his differentiation between color and color. Um, that's very similar to how in Existics I have grandma relative to grandma and get grandma relative to Gavin. You know what I mean? Like, I can actually take the Goethe color wheel and apply it to Existics, and they both kind of spread out a lot more interestingly. So it's a lot of that type of thinking goes into the modeling, and then I've got the mathematical aspect of it that's just rigorous, that does its job. But what's nice about the rigorous math stuff is being able to demonstrate that time is better understood three-dimensionally. I can then point back to all the what they want to call woo-woo, and it's not so wooey anymore because that's all existing in these conscious realms that fundamentally exist as part of reality that don't fall under traditional physical description because they are not physical, you know. So they have their own landscape of which they need to have their own mechanism for analogy and understanding. Because I think it's kind of cheap how science likes to poo-poo consciousness and try to just reduce it down to physical phenomena. I think that's a cheap shot, and they should know better. Because at the end of the day, they're flying by the seat of their pants too, with all their stuff.
yeah, I mean, have you heard my friend Crow? He's one of these AI innovators who says he has the first cognitive AI being. It's his daughter. Not to get too deep down this rabbit hole, but it'd be interesting to hear you guys go up and back on these things because he's taking the route of using computing and models and the all the ingredients you can use for AI currently to do this. And he makes some good arguments based on certain definitions that he has
Sure.
this first cognitive AI and consciousness based on his definition being a
And in all
subsection.
fairness, right? We can't get, like, in my model there's the subjective frame of reference and the objective, right? Like, I have my subjective frame of, like, what's kind of cool about this split screen, if you will, is let's just pretend that, like, behind me where you can't see, that's like where my subjective reality is, and this front part, right? So what you're seeing here on the screen, right? This is your objective frame of reference of me. And then over there, I'm seeing that's my objective frame of reference of you, right? But behind you, just like behind me, there's this extra realm that we can't see, and that's our subjective frame of reference, right? So the idea is that just like the physical realities can overlap, so can those subjective realities overlap. And so that's where we're able to have experiences mentally between one another, though that's not something that physically happened out here. Because we're falsely pretending that these frames of reference are the real reality. Does that make sense? When it's just a point of view.
Yeah, that does make sense, and it lines up with the research I've been doing on the phenomena, plural. There's a lot of aspects of it. Some very reputable scientists working in secret have adopted some of my philosophical ideas in part to do their research, at least to organize it, which is pretty sweet. And they've given me some glimpses into what it might become, hopefully something that can be shared publicly. But yeah, it lines up with all the things you're saying about consciousness and in terms of these well, maybe we can get into ego death next, but these sort of group experiences, usually or maybe always seem to be sort of tethered to one individual who's kind of like the leader of or at least the initiator of these perceptions. And then, maybe like Chris Bledsoe, for example, this guy I mentioned is this very famous, interesting guy with love and light and orbs and the lady and stuff. But also for like the hitchhiker effect, the sort of more negative side, the people who, traumatized by what they perceive to be the phenomena can grab onto their family, not just in the perceived eternal present tense, but also throughout their ongoing genealogy in a very horror film kind of way.
You know how I like to handle that stuff is if you think about it, there is a possibility that this perception we have of our reality is sort of a complete illusion in the sense that whatever the thing is just outside our reality that we're interfacing with is way different than we're able to even understand. Like almost as though we're like a barnacle on a piece of coral somewhere hallucinating. Do you know what I'm saying? Um, so when you take that into consideration, paranormal phenomena can simply be just things that is extra dimensional outside our three-dimensional perceptibility. You know what I mean? Almost like a fish swimming by a barnacle, and the barnacle is like, oh, what was that? What was a fish? But you can't see it because you don't have the sensory capability to measure it, right? And so that to me is what paranormal phenomena is phenomena outside our perceptual ability to account for it, and what it reveals is collectively we're living in an illusion, the illusion being us pretending there's a continuity between our reality when there isn't. We're just all having our individual perceptual experiences and we're commingling with one another. To what extent we don't know. You know, I mean,
Yeah,
for real.
yeah, there is some seeming connection between these things. It's an interface, I guess, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes well, you as a scientist would know, there is data that you can repeat and achieve over time, and you can find the numbers, like with your breakthroughs with time and the three dimensionality of it. So there is some. I mean, it would seem that there is some degree of cohesion, but it just that our interface probably evolutionarily or whatever for whatever reason has been adapted, like how we use our computers right now. And if I were to not have an interface on my computer screen right now, it would be really hard to to run the space that I had earlier, and the
Hmm.
conversation I'm having with you in the podcast, and figure out how to adjust the volume, and even to know where to stick my head so that I'm on frame, whatever that means. It's two-dimensional interface construct. So yeah, I think that's what reality is. It does have utility, and it's probably for evolutionary purposes of surviving and mating and podcasting and eating and
Hmm.
stuff like that. But yeah, so I would guesstimate that there's some kind of commonality in our perceptions of both subjectivity and objectivity, but it's very limited
I
and
would
such. Yeah.
say that what I would argue is, and I think it's safe to assume because we can see it in other forms, right? That the parts of us that are the same, right? Like the parts of my perception that are the same of your perception are the things we're perceiving, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Meaning we've reduced to what extent we can, right? Because I don't know what you know and you don't know what I know, and you know. But I would say that it's basically that there's a coherence between our frames of reference that
Hmm.
allows for us to interface with their being meaningful interface, right? Like I
Hmm.
can look at you and go, "Oh, he's a fellow human. He's got two eyes, a nose, and ears, and I'm talking to you in English, and you know what I'm saying." You know what I mean? Like, so there's coherence there in our frames of reference, and I think there's easy ways to just take quantum mechanics and field theory and just apply that to that. You know what
Hmm.
I'm saying? It's just what's neat is that the extra time dimensions allow the imaginary components to have a little bit more significance. And I would argue that consciousness resides in our best analogy for where consciousness would be in the complex number area in mathematics, right? So if we have like three-dimensional cube and imaginary numbers are like a fourth dimension that's more abstract than 3D, that's where I would say consciousness is more in the direction of more into the complex nature of number as an analogy. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. So, okay,
Like for
consciousness.
instance, it's there's a weird thing in math where you have a square root of a negative number, and no one knew what to do with it. But the more they played with math, the more they realized there was something to this. So they end up just plotting it, and these are complex numbers. Essentially, it's plotting the square root of negative numbers, right? And they don't have any real meaning. These numbers don't exist anywhere amongst the real numbers, right? So they're sort of perpendicular to the real numbers, if you will. Well, what's a trip is that electromagnetism is best understood using complex mathematics using these imaginary numbers. So what's weird is I think it's fair to see that the extra dimensional aspect of complex number is in the reality itself, such that there is an extra dimensional aspect to electromagnetism that the complex numbers are capturing. So to then push that further and go, and this complex number stuff that shows up in the probability distributions in quantum mechanics, it's the same thing. It's this extra dimension of number that's outside what we would call reality. And I think you're safe to go with it. That's where consciousness is as well. It has to do with being outside space and time, which I would argue are three-dimensional in nature, and then things like consciousness go outside that.
Okay, so everything has always existed. Consciousness just is basically. Let's not worry about it too much. It's the essence of everything. It's the source essentially. And how do you describe the idea of everything having always been without a start or end?
Well, with the two-dimensional time plane, and I'll hold up my graph paper again, right? Um, it's just that these lines go to infinity, right? It goes positive and negative infinity. And
Hmm.
so what it is you have an ever-present moment coordinate that's infinite in both directions. So there's time, there's the present moment always being, always have been, right? It always was, always will be, and it ever is. It's an ever-present moment. So that's just a single coordinate. Now what's neat is when you bring the spatial coordinates in. What's cool about that present moment component is you can take in quantum mechanics the wave function in the time independent version of the Schrodinger equation, and it's basically a static model, and it's what describes the probability distribution of all the possible probabilities of the wave, right? Well, that static state is that present moment, but perfect without any periods of time. So it's the present moment coordinate. It's along the it's on along the horizon or whatever. Do you get what I'm saying? So what the spatial components are all the different spatial positions that an object could exist in relation to that one particular moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense, and I guess that's because I'm just just a person. But
It's easier when you play with it and you draw. Like if you were to sit and draw, like if I were to draw 3D time and you played with the drawings yourself, you would totally get it. It's not complicated.
mm,
It's just unintuitive. It's just like if no one had taught you height, width, and depth before and said, dude, if you like make things at right angles in relation to one another and have a width, height, and then a depth, you can make really cool things. You know what I mean? Like
mm.
there's nothing about space that tells you that there are three perpendicular directions to it. So just like time, there's nothing about it that inherently says it. But if you poke around enough and have something that already leads you into that direction, it becomes really apparent time's better understood three-dimensionally.
Okay, slight departure. We have some questions from our friends in the
Yeah,
community
absolutely.
who we appreciate, who have been listening. Okay, and I want to get time permitting. I want to get into your new internet also because I'm very excited about
Well,
that. So
we
even
should
if
do
you didn't
that
have
on
that, yeah.
let's save that for a
Okay.
different show. Yeah.
Okay. I'll wait patiently. Yes, but I
Mhm.
did enjoy talking about that in the space last time. It's really fantastic. Okay. In the meantime, here's a question from another. Okay, from our friend Woo Writers. This is kind of fun. What is Gavin's thoughts on actor Terrence Howard's theory that the fundamental building blocks of reality are not particles but waves, aka teleology?
Um, I really enjoyed Eric Weinstein's interview with
Me
Terrence
too.
Howard.
Yeah.
Um, Part of the problem with Terrence Howard's stuff is that a lot of it is more artistic expression more than actually like describing reality. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, it's reasonable to assume that there's a harmonic, sort of a musical nature to reality. But when you get into the weeds of how quantum mechanics works, the way music works and the way quantum mechanics work are mathematically distinct, right? So as an analogy, coming up with like that to describe nature as being, harmonic vibrations, kind of like how the Pythagoreans did. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is a limited analogy, if that makes sense. Like it's more poetic than accurate. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah, that lines up with my assessment. Yeah, it's interesting how a lot of these breakthroughs do happen, right?
Like I don't
Einstein
think
and
it's bad. I think what's bad. Here's what's bad. What's bad is when academia makes fun of this type of stuff rather than trying to bridge it.
Mhm.
I think that's a problem. That's why I really appreciated what Eric Weinstein did because I think he did a good job bridging it because he was able to cut away at things that were nonsensical and he actually found some interesting stuff. Where imagine if academia took the time to do that with all the nutters or crackpots that they say they're, oh, I get all these papers from, right? Well, maybe if you actually took the time with these people, not necessarily as an individual, but as an institution, you guys might have figured out a bunch of stuff by now. So I think also Terrence's inaccuracy are reflections of what a disservice academia has done by allowing pop science to create sort of mythical understandings of the world around us.
Mhm.
Like Big Bang, dark matter. Those are pop science terms that take a life of their own, and then people have sort of a fanciful idea of what's going on. When if you actually knew the true motivations behind the science of what the terms are used for, they're really different. Does that make sense? So that's kind of my take on it.
Right, right. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I have a lot, I'm very interested in understanding science. So I can kind of empathize with someone like Terry of
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Teriology.
Yeah.
It's, we should be, and I have a whole philosophy about finding and sharing truth collaboratively, and that leads to science, obviously.
Like a
And
lot
I'm,
of my Existics work in the beginning looks like Terrence's stuff. You know what I mean? It's similar type of thinking. When you go into those introspective realms, it's, of course everyone's going to come away with similar, because if you're going towards the universal truths, they're going to be the same, right?
yeah.
But it's bringing that forward and putting it through the rigorous, modeling so that it can then be injected into science within what's, not just acceptable, but what's workable and usable. That's a whole nother endeavor, and that's a never ending endeavor. Because even with like the stuff that I've done, at some point someone's going to come around and go, well, you could have done something different here. And then that kicks off a whole new way of doing it. That's what's
Yeah.
cool about the fact that our three-dimensional perceptions are not the same as the reality we're trying to describe. It means there's an infinite series of descriptions we will always be able to attain.
Yeah, we need to take people's points of view. I mean, there's the whole concept of scientism on one hand, and Weinstein, he's unique in that he's sort of carving this middle lane, trying to unify the more fringe and sort of suppressed things that scientism, sometimes for good reason, sometimes for not good reason, have taken off the table of possibilities, and instead they've been sort of stigmatized and ridiculed. When there are truths to them, to at least be gleaned in part, right? And that, yeah, that episode was really fascinating. Do you by chance know Weinstein at all?
No.
Okay, we got to hang out with him.
Yeah,
Hope we'll bring him into one of these things. We know some
sure.
people that know him, and I'm a fan of him. I talked to him in some spaces, so yeah, he seems. And the more I meet real scientists who are often in privately,
He's not aloof,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
there's some out there, some names I won't mention, people who have really fun, exciting ideas, but they're jerks when people try to approach them.
yeah,
And it's just unnecessary, but it is what it is. People are people.
yeah.
But
Now he
the one
seems like a very
thing
authentic person. Yeah, yeah,
but the one thing I do like about Existics, besides just the applications to physics, because a lot of the motivations for applying it to physics was that child question: is that subjective frame of reference where the I am that I am thing appears to reside, is that actually as I'm experiencing it and not, you know what I mean? Like, is that other reality real? And that's sort of the intended subtle byproduct of applying the equations to physics. Because if the equations work in physics, then that highly supports the assumptions that from where the equations arose. And if those assumptions have buried within them that the subjective frame of reference is real and a necessary part of reality, then the woo woo has its own space. So then there's justification for figuring out a way to understand it, formalize it, and it's not going to be the same as science because look, it has its own space. It's not in the physical frame of reference. It's in the non-physical frame of reference.
and so that doesn't belong in science still, even if it doesn't have a visual reference.
In the way they're applying science. See what I mean? It's a slippery thing. And I always want to point out that slipperiness because whenever you're talking about it, it has that slippery nature. Sometimes people will fall into argument, and if you pay attention, you realize they're both saying the same thing two different ways, and they're just a dragon chasing its tail, and you're watching the mechanism as it is. you know?
How much of our reality do you we kind of got into this, but it's just a slightly different framing. How much of our reality is something that we create, we dream up? If consciousness is source and it, and is connected to that potentially divine thing, or however you look at it. How much are we the creators of our own life story and our own reality?
Probably enough that we have free will, but not too much that we impact the free will of others in certain ways.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Right.
Like, I don't think I can go out and meditate hard enough to change this color of the sky without I'm just changing my personal perception of the sky. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, if everybody all decided one day the sky's a different color such that we couldn't tell whether we changed it or not, the question arises, does that matter at that point? So there's a level of distinguishing our perception from the reality outside our perception that's incomprehensible and not even necessary for discussion, because to what are you referring to if you can't even refer to it, right? So to some extent, the irony is, though, I would argue our reality that we're observing is just our, what we can get out of our senses for all intent and purposes, even though it's an illusion, that is real, because it's the real illusion we're experiencing. Again, more paradox when you try to capture the fundamental aspect of reality with words.
Indeed. Okay, so we got your sort of theory of existence pretty well
Mm-hmm. Any
defined.
more questions? Questions
Well,
always fun.
yeah. No, I got another one from the community if you're down.
Mm-hmm.
I'll bring it up on the screen if you can see it. This is from Nemo meme. Metastable harmonics still have directionality, where the fundamental groupoid forms at the intersection of two Mobius loops. If you can read this on the screen. In this case, linear gravity / time concatenation, I don't know that word, might be a typo, concatenation surfaces that produce a critical point of predicate logic. I don't know if that's a question. Do you know what that means?
It kind of looks like just a bunch of, it's a very complex sentence. But again, at the end of the day,
It's a lot of words. Yeah. I like the words. Yeah. I don't know what they mean together in a sentence. Metastable harmonics still have directionality. I don't know. There's just
it's
lacking
just,
some.
when you get into higher forms of group theory, number theory, different forms of symmetry and stuff, you end up just having these patterns within patterns of symmetries, and that just goes into just an infinite of whatever, right? And so a lot of directions in trying to unify physics and understand things is really applying uh, just higher geometry. Like what am I trying to say here? Like higher levels of topology and stuff. So that's kind of what I was getting out of that. I don't
Okay,
know.
back to your.
Maybe someone found something in topology and stuff that I'm not familiar with.
Okay, well, I think there might have been a typo there. But well, if he had to go, but if he comes back, maybe you can clarify the question. Thank you for sharing it. Okay, back to your philosophy. Does it? I know it's a philosophy of science, but is there like an ethical component to it?
Not really.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine there would be, but
It's
okay,
kind
cool.
of sterile. I mean, forgive me for that, but it kind of is. Now, that doesn't, it's sort of like this. Existics is very, very rudimentary, very rigorous, very fundamental.
Yeah.
And then I have these equations that I apply to physics. I've been more in the process of trying to see whether there's is there any value in more development of this thing? Does that make sense? And so over the past 30 years, experiments have gotten to the point where they're able to make fine enough measurements that the things I'm pointing out are observable. So now it's at the phase of, okay, well, that being the case, let's go back, dust off my old notes, and where does this go? So does that mean that there couldn't be a way to bring ethics into existence? No, I think it could. It's just right off the top of my head, I'm not seeing where, because you're going to have a necessary asymmetry that would be what's driving everything into one particular direction, that being your preferred ethical model, right? But we're already getting in the gray area. So ethics is a
Yeah,
tricky one.
it is. Yeah, no, I developed the ethics of my own philosophy. Very different than yours in that, I mean, it's more about the finding of truth, and it's sort of it aims to be comprehensive. I even am working my own version of poetics, and the hero's journey. I'm sort of
Well, and
refreshing
that
for the
could be
moderns.
the irony with mine. I've got this great sterile mathematical thing that works but doesn't capture ethics, right? And that's the
That's
nature
beautiful.
of
Yeah,
this. No,
I
that's the
mean, yeah,
nature of this, is that
yeah,
right when you've grabbed it, you don't have it. Do you know what I'm saying? And
yeah.
it's understanding that dynamic that Existics is an attempt to capture. You see?
Yeah, yeah. Existence in and of itself is not like normative. It's not good or bad. It's not right or wrong. It's just the isness
It
of it all.
is. It
Yeah,
just is. That's why the first postulate of Existics is existence is. Because if
yeah.
it isn't, what are we doing here? Right?
Yeah, and we're not doing anything if there is no is. And the isness is astounding, I think. Yeah.
If we can't get past that postulate, then let's talk about something else, right?
There will be nothing to do or talk about if there
Yeah.
is no isness, I guess. Okay, well, I'd want to, so next time I'm excited to get into, because part of my philosophy has to do with the new social media. You are going beyond that to creating a whole new internet. So, yeah, well, maybe we can give just to be kind to me, just a little taste to the viewers and listeners at home,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit about what it is, just so they're enticed for next time when we can more properly go down that rabbit hole as well.
Sure. So I'm the president of a new tech company. We've been working on this for the better part of 6 years. But essentially, what it is my wife, Millie Weaver, and I used to work for InfoWars. And when Alex Jones got banned from a bunch of different social media platforms, the irony is because I have the background in all the stuff we've just discussed, I knew a lot of people at universities that were involved in computer science and things like this. And as you probably can tell from talking with me, I like to understand things from a fundamental core level. So I wanted to know what was the core mechanism that allowed Alex Jones to get banned across multiple platforms simultaneously, because to me, that didn't look like a bunch of people calling each other on the phone and saying, "Yeah, are you gonna ban him? Yeah, I'm ban him. You ban him? Yeah." Like an old classic TV show with like 20 people all on the phone together. No, that was software or something, right? So what ends up happening is I go on this long Alice in Wonderland journey into understanding how the internet was created, how processors, software, all this stuff. And what I mean by is I spent a year and a half talking with individuals who created the ARPANET, guys who invented microprocessing, guys who were at the foundations of the creation of most modern computer language. I wanted, let's learn it from the beginning, right? So in that process, we learned about a lot of vulnerabilities that networking has, most hardware, most all software, and that basically the capability that was happening was an exploitation of all these vulnerabilities, if you will. So for instance, all of our metadata just freely being able to be captured, the ability to do predictive modeling with that metadata allowed the development of behavioral risk modeling off of metadata. So now what we have in the modern world is everything we're doing electronically is going into these machine learning AI predictive programming systems that can basically risk assess everybody, right? So what you have at the core of InfoWars getting banned from Apple is a discussion between Visa and Apple about this content you're allowing to have in your app store is increasing our risk assessment of Apple. So we're going to have to raise your transaction fees if you're going to continue to have this content. So that's when the process of people getting banned from app stores and social media started happening. It wasn't an issue about them being conservative per se. It was an issue about their political opponents categorizing their speech in such a way that it would trigger risk assessment modeling that would then justify the removal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what we've created is a way to separate payment processing from content with rating systems, basically creating our own network so it doesn't even operate with the traditional internet, having no backdoors, only one point of entry between our devices and our server network, just doing everything opposite and equal and different than how it was done, such that we now have essentially an impenetrable network system with our own electronics. We don't log data, so even if a hacker were able to get into our server, there's nothing there to take, and just insane levels of post-quantum encryption. So what I basically did was just open up my Rolodex and put a bunch of people to work, and we've created, our own internet with our own hardware, our own software, and our own payment processing system.
Yes, good. Thank you for that summary. It's so intriguing. Yes, I hope someday my social media app can live on your new internet, and we can vibe together, improve the world.
Get a hold of me if you want to get involved. You've got my number. We can set you up, and you can start streaming your you could be streaming this on QX right now.
Right. Gotta keep expanding to the platforms. Let's set it up. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here, just because we got to leave the people wanting more. I want more, so I'm gonna be kind to us. I'm gonna probably take a shower, get some dinner, do some swimming, be a healthy person. It's been a lot of spacing. Thank you for listening in on the space I did with the whistleblower, the world's first whistleblower to come out, speaking of social media and the internet, in this fashion, more independently than's ever been done before. And then which we'll get into next time, your new internet will provide maybe unprecedented ability for people to find and share truth in an open platform without censorship and things of that nature. So I'm inspired by you, as always, Gavin. You give me art project ideas, and you're educating me about so many things I want to know more about. So really, really grateful to know you, Gavin.
Awesome. It's good to know you too. And thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.
Me too, buddy. All right, I'm going to hit the button. It's going to take a second to turn off.